Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we're going to talk about 3 tips on winter jig fishing to make sure you're catching more bass this winter when you're fishing with a jig. So stay tuned and let's get right into it. There's been so many variations of this bait that has been adapted to fish pretty much any body of water or type of cover. But in the winter time, there's a couple things that are very important with your jig to actually catch more fish. While your standard flipping jig that you would throw in the summertime or in the spring on 20-pound test, big jig, big trailer, can still get bites. If you do a couple things to this jig or get an entire different jig in general, you will actually catch more bass in the winter because it will be more appealing to the fish you're fishing for. The first thing you need to do with your jig is actually pay attention to the size of the jig. And when we're looking at the size of the jig, there's actually 2 sizes we're looking at: the head size of the jig and the actual size of the jig itself. So when we're talking about head size, in the winter time, you typically want your baits to have a slower fall because everything's moving very slow. So if you hop your jig off a limb, you don't want it to rocket back down to the bottom real fast. It doesn't look natural. What you want is your jig to come off a log and just slowly flutter back down to the bottom, like a bluegill or anything else would if it was swimming around a brush pile and wanted to sink down to the bottom. It would just slowly make its way down. So where I would typically fish a 1/2 ounce jig in the summertime, I'll go to a 3/8 or even a 1/4 or 5/16 in the wintertime because it looks more natural to the fish. The other size that I look at in the wintertime is the actual size of the jig itself. And as you can see between these 2 jigs here, the full-size flipping jig is much larger in a few different areas. The actual sizing of the skirt strands are much bigger. It has more strands to the skirt, and it even has a bigger hook and a longer skirt in general. This smaller finesse flipping jig or other types of finesse jigs that you can find will have a smaller hook, like a 2/0 hook compared to a 4/0 hook in this big one. Or the strands of the actual skirt material are much finer and move much easier in the water with a lighter weight. And the skirt is actually shorter itself, so it's going to create a much more compact profile for these fish to eat. And when they're not looking for a big meal this time of year, they're just looking for any little snack they might be able to eat on, and they don't need a lot to keep going because their metabolism is slow. A smaller jig will get you more bites because it's just something that they can eat if it lands in front of their face. The second key thing that I pay attention to my jig in the wintertime is my color choice, as you would any other time of year, but it's much more limited this time of year. I almost never throw brown in the wintertime. Any type of brown, crawfish color, anything like that, I really don't throw it that much just because a lot of the crawfish are in hibernation this time of year. If you have a really warm day and the sun is beating down on the bank with some rock, those crawfish will feel that heat and kind of work their way out of the rocks just for a little bit of sunshine. And the bass know that as well. The rocks hold heat. They will go up there to get warm, and you'll have a perfect storm of being able to throw crawfish colors that time. But for almost every other day in the wintertime when it's very cold, those bass are going to eat on bluegills and other little bait fish that are swimming around the brush piles or rock piles that they're hanging out on that time of year, because they're just hanging out in deeper water where the water is much warmer. So I basically narrow down my color selection to a green pumpkin jig 99% of the time in the winter. That's what a bluegill kind of looks like, a greenish color. Any type of bluegill color jig works really, really well this time of year. And then if you get a lot of rain in the winter time and it muddies up your water, typically the water stays pretty clear this time of year. But as we start venturing into spring in like the end of February or March for other places, you get snow melt, you get rain for spring, all that stuff starts happening. The water will get very dirty, and that's when I will actually go to a black and blue jig because it stands out in that dirty water much better. It's not that it imitates anything, but it just allows the bass to find your jig and key in on it and actually get some bites. It's still going to mimic a bluegill by shape and silhouette, and you're basically mimicking a bluegill all winter long with these jigs. That's the key. And the last thing that you need to pay attention to with your jigs this time of year is your trailer selection. I keep it very, very simple this time of year and pretty much exclusively fish a chunk style trailer where it's just a chunk of plastic you can put your hook on and has no action, very thin flaps for the claws, basically just to make it look like a crawfish or a bluegill shape and to fill out your jig. You don't want to go throwing a big 4 and 5 inch beaver or the rage craws or anything like that. They make great jig trailers when the water's warmer. But right now when the water's cold, that action is just too much for the fish this time of year. So when you go to that lighter jig, your jig will fall slower, and if you add a bigger trailer, it would fall slower too. But the key to go to the lighter jig is so you can throw this smaller trailer and still get a slower fall. And since you're throwing this smaller trailer, this is only a 2.5 inch bait. When you put it on that compact jig, you really have a small compact jig, maybe 3.5 inches at most, all total jig included, where a regular flipping jig, you're pushing 4 to 5 inches on a completed jig. So downsizing your trailer, making your bait smaller will get you more bites, and paying attention to that your bait doesn't have any action to it will also get you more bites. Another thing you can do when you put your jig trailer on, typically when you put on a chunk jig trailer, you just stab the plastic and let it dangle off the back. And when you do that, it'll swing all over on your jig and flop up and down and have a lot of action when it's not meant to this time of year. So what I do with the smaller jig is actually thread it up on my jig so that it's on the hook fixed, and just the pinchers gently move as I fish it through the water. You want to fish this jig really, really slow. You want to drag it on the bottom, hop it through limbs. You want that slow glide and fall and to hover in place. That's what a lot of these bait fish are doing this time of year. If you've ever been out there fishing on a warm, sunny day after a prolonged cold period of time, and you find some logs up on the bank, you will see all these bluegills are just slowly drifting around, sunning themselves up next to the log and stuff like that. That's what that lives around those logs in the wintertime, except on a colder day they just sink back down to the bottom and stay around that same log. The bass know that and will hang around these logs, and that's why if you size your jig correctly and give it the right action profile and fall rate in the wintertime, it can be a killer bait up on any type of log or laydown or even underwater brush pile, because all these bluegills are hanging around on the bottom there. So if this video helped you learn more about how to fish a jig and things you can do to get more bites with a jig, go ahead and check out this video right here where I talked about other baits that you need to have for January bass fishing right in the heart of the winter. So if you enjoyed today's video, leave a like down below and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any more of my fishing videos coming up. Thanks for watching.